Gregg Henriques, welcome to the Parallax podcast again.
Thank you, sir. It's lovely to be back. Good to see you, Tom.
Always great to have you, man. It's a super interesting topic, psyche, consciousness. And so you just published a new book, UTOK, The Unified Theory of
That's right.
Knowledge.
I just got my author's copies in the mail yesterday, so I've got 10 copies here around. So I'm handing out to friends and family. It's perfect for Halloween. It's a great Halloween gift.
Well, it's great. So it's published by Sky Meadow Press, no?
That's right. Brendan Graham Dempsey, who's in this meta-modern spirituality circle. I decided that enabled me to give it a really funky design and cool pictures and everything else, and he did a great job with that. So a shout out to him. I'm really happy that it's part of his budding system.
Fantastic. So I was reading the book, and I was wondering if you are really like an alchemist or something.
Well, that's so right. So it has an alchemist feel, and UTOK. What do I say unified all the time? What do I mean by conciliant? Unified means conciliant. What does conciliant means is actually means a jumping together of perspectives that gives us coherence. And what I argue with UTOK is I think we're missing some key pieces of the puzzle that's creating our lenses to be all fractured and confused. When you get those lenses in the right order, then all of a sudden a lot of things jump into play that makes sense. This was published in the meta-modern world. The basic idea of meta-modernism is that we can trace the evolution, especially if we're situated in the West. I think it is more complicated in the East. But if we look at the evolution of cultural sensibilities from the West, an oral indigenous 50,000 years ago, then a traditional mindset emerges where we get technology and societies that then have to regulate large numbers of people. You get nation states and religions and refined knowledge. And we see then the Bronze Age and then the Axial Age explosion, but those are all traditional. And then there's a time period between traditional knowledge and modern science. That's where the alchemists would reside. And we get this then explosion. Really, the alchemists are bridging from from traditional approaches like in Christianity, paganism, etc. Then they're going to give rise to modernity, which at an intellectual level is marked by the scientific enlightenment. The Renaissance into scientific enlightenment gets solidified in the scientific enlightenment. Then we get the postmodern critique, which is a deconstructionist view that says, hey, you guys are saying your truth, but it's really nested in a larger socio-cultural reality that you haven't separated from. The meta-modern view gets reflective of that. It's a long-winded way of saying is that this book, in the meta-modern sensibility, tries to include and transcend, and it finds a nice place in The Alchemist that's sort of bridging traditional down into oral indigenous, into modern, and then with a postmodern irony that we're aware of our self-reflection, and then so the meta-modern include transcend synthesis of those sensibilities. So, I'm blending lots of shit together and trying to create some magic.
That's great. No, obviously, you mentioned that, the transition between the traditional and the modern kind of sensibilities, and famously, Newton was the last of the alchemists, no, as everybody knows. But also like a book, I'm looking at the book as itself, and the book seldom exists in a vacuum. And so it's like it has history, the way it is written, it is presented, and it's very much reminiscent of, the occult and alchemist books that were kind of around, 18th, 19th centuries, like in a playful kind of way, because they were trying to present, with quasi-rationalistic systems like the Kabbalah, like a unified vision of the universe, while using occult symbols like the coin or like the tree of knowledge and all of these symbols that you're like using in your book too.
That's exactly right. And I think that what the book is trying to do is it's trying to create an archetypal paradigm. That's really where our human embodied experience as psyche entities that then collectively get narratives together. That's the archetype in a paradigm that bridges actually into science. And you can look at Newton as finding the path to physics, but he has a pretty concrete version of what the Bible should be and what that second order should be. And his life is really trying to bridge those. But his specificity that he grants us with the physical sciences and calculus into physics can't get to the specificity and concreteness of Christianity, at least from my vantage point. And so he's seeing that, but if we shift it slightly and look at the human archetypes like the tree of knowledge inside of the garden, inside underneath the concept of God. Those types of things actually are human archetypes through the cultural ages. And UTOK is something that says we can pull human archetypes, cultural paradigms, and science together. So it's a meta-modern alchemy.
Right. But I wondered because, like in a previous conversation, we were talking about how UTOK as a unified system kind of choose the, the esoteric, spiritual razzle dazzle of a Wilberian model. It's more grounded in the natural sciences and, and in academia, let's say. But still, you're using explicitly occult symbols, which kind of brings it back in. And so I was wondering if that, because like as soon as you're using, a term like coin or garden or tree of knowledge, it's like you can't escape the esotericism built in historically in these terms. And so the question is like, was that like a conscious decision?
More intuitive than conscious, and more I would be led by these ideas. I like the term inventio. I learned that from John Vervaeke. The inventio is the difference, is the binding between an invention that you create, like a pure artistic creation, a creative expression, a discovery, something completely exists inside of you. It's an old term that binds some sort of patterning that you're groping towards as you build something to build it, sort of like a lock and a key kind of relation almost. That's been my experience of this, meaning that enormous amount of this is sort of like, I'm not intending to do this. Like you didn't, if you were to ask me, you say, okay, I'm going to build a scientific system. I didn't start with the idea of we need a conciliant system that builds science.
Oh no, we come to this, how this book came about. We will come to
this is not, it doesn't start with any master plan that then says, okay, now I'm going to embark on this and I'll build this. Absolutely not. I get pulled. It feels like a discovery, but it's also a molded construction, especially aspects of it are aesthetic. And then a lot of the time I'm shocked by the implicit unconscious knowledge that I have. Like to call it a coin, like my brother, I knew the coin had some symbolism. I haven't gone into tarot cards. My brother wrote me and said, actually, the Greeks do put coins on the eyes of their soldiers to pass them into the next thing. You should have mentioned that. And I was like, I had no idea they did that. That's really cool. I'm not studying along those lines. So I get pulled into it. And what I am amazed at how much the flowering of these archetypes already exists in the structure. So I'm finding my way. I do believe it's valuable that if you are grounded in science, the way I argue that I am, in fact, I argue UTOK's the most scientifically coherent system available, full stop. Okay, so if you care about science and I'm a scientist, like Jim Rutt, UTOK's the most scientifically available system, period, full stop. Okay, and then from that, I can then pull a particular set of consistency across archetypes, okay, that emerge, and I find them in my journey, well, then that's all the better. I mean, that is what consilience sort of suggests. So that's been my experience. I got pulled into doing it. I enjoy doing that. I haven't been cautious. I will be on Jim Rutt talking about this book, and I know he's going to be like, Greg, this is crazy. Why don't you just?
But it's an obvious question because especially if you approach a topic like this as an academic, you normally stay away from these from this language, because of this association and this history. So you did this to enrich the reading experience. So there's a passage in your book, where you describe how, this theory originally came about. And you write in the book, so I think I can say it. So you got high.
Totally, right. By the way, where I am, it's decriminalized totally. I smoke weed regularly. That's totally fine. That's legal where I am. It's just like having a drink.
But you were on the verge of
being. Anyway, it is totally true. This is the moment, by the way. That's the original Tree of Knowledge diagram that I'm stoned in the summer of 1997. It's right behind me. So yes, go ahead.
I'm fairly sure that a lot of insights, from psychologists or from, scientists come from weird states, that are induced by some drugs or whatever, Okay. So, but you kind of affirm that and you say, oh no, this is how it came to be, and I'm using this kind of language, and so it's like the question still is, what was the rationale behind, using this kind of language? Is it just to, make it easier, make it more flourishing, the images, or like what?
All I'll say is I followed where my soul went. Right? There's no like I'm not. I'll put it this way: I didn't follow the conservative argument that says don't do this.
Right.
That's really the argument. It's like if this works, I'm following it. Okay, and then I found that it would work, and I was okay with it. So in my journey, and I'll say here, a lot of this entire thing is and I learned from this. Get stoned, okay, for me, see associations, some of which are really cool, some of which are not. Wake up the next morning and use your analytic mind to say what actually really fits in a coherent system and what's stone bullshit. Okay?
Right.
And then systematically craft a picture to the extent, here's what I'll put it this way, to the extent that it maintains its integrity and blends, bleeds, and grabs into this alchemic elements is a good thing. That's my judgment. To the extent that it maintains its coherence, it's a good thing. The idea that it's a bad thing is an artifact of modernity. Okay? So the idea that you're going to lose your academic reputation, or that will shy everybody away, or the institution will never pay attention to you. This would never be in Nature or even in a peer review. Fuck that.
Right.
Okay, so that's really the mindset. It's like, I don't care if I'm on a line here of understanding. This peer review is actually a conventional bullshit that's actually potentially problematic and very arguably what constrains the two cultures of the sciences and the humanities from seeing each other. If I find a line that works and doesn't threaten my scientific integrity, I'm after it, and I am totally fine with that. So essentially the mindset is, if it works, I'm doing it in this regard, and I think it works this way. So that's why I'm putting it out there.
Okay, so I think after 13 minutes already, we set the stage for the crucial question that I have, and give me a little bit of time to frame that, because I'm still thinking about this, right? Okay. And so because in a sense I feel that psyche is a self-deceptional system, right? So in the kind of sense, if you look at myth, psyche was depicted as a butterfly. Butterfly, obviously a symbol of transformation. And then you have the interplay between psyche and eros. Eros is the male impetus, the male motive, let's say, to give some shape and form. And so you're just alluding to this. You have like this weird ideas, and then you go at it with your rational mind, right? And so a couple of weeks, months back, there was a paper flowing around about the 500 theories of consciousness. You probably have seen it, right? So there's a whole spectrum of theories, and probably you could order them from more likely to less likely. There are some theories that overlap, some theories that don't. But it's weird because, you would think they can't be all true, they can't be all false. But obviously every author believes in them. Right? As it happens, everybody has an idea, everybody believes in things that are not there, things that happened in the past that didn't happen, wish for things that could be, that will never happen. And so we are living in this fantasy realm, especially if it's, when we are talking about psyche modeling itself and modeling the realities and expectations of itself, right? And so the question is, how do we deal with, it wasn't Robert Anton Wilson. It wasn't a psychologist who said this, whatever the thinker thinks, the believer believes, right? So there's a mechanism in there. Do you get what I'm...
Totally. Well, first off, right. So Robert Kuhn wrote The Landscape of Consciousness article. That may be what you're referring to. That is the big thing that came out in biology and physics, I think it was. And he's closer to Truth Guy, and he's done more summary of the different perspectives in consciousness, and then he came out with a 150-page journal article on this topic. So that's called The Landscape of Consciousness. Great review source. So let's just now.
I was a little bit all over the place, but let's.
Okay. So well, right, and then we said psyche. Okay. All right. Then you said, well, psyche, and does the psyche know itself? And a thinker thinks, a believer believes, and then there's all this possibility of, hey, you can see it's the 16th, or see it's the 17th, and it's really the 16th. Psyche can be wrong. What the hell is this thing called psyche? Okay. Well, UTOK comes with a different angle on this, okay? And it says you've actually, the intelligentsia, at least the general models, are broken in the way they grip the world, okay? And the first thing that I would point to in terms of this consciousness model is that it doesn't address what's called the problem of psychology. That's UTOK's home, okay? And UTOK's, with the problem of psychology, you will not, my critique is, you are going to have the same problems in the science of consciousness, okay, that we encountered, and I say we as a psychologist historically, as we tried to generate the science of psychology. Do you know why? Because what was psychology first? The science of consciousness. And then it became the science of behavior and mind.
Right.
Okay. And now the hard problem of consciousness is David Chalmers coming out and saying we can separate out phenomenology mind from computational mind. Psychology deals with computational mind, that's fine. We can't solve the phenomenology mind. And then you have philosophers and physicists and everybody in neurosciences trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness, which is the phenomenological mind that Chalmers separates off of the psychological mind.
Right.
Okay? Well, UTOK comes along and said, well, Chalmers doesn't get this right. Well, he gets it right. There is a mind-mind problem. Phenomenological mind is different and separate from psychological. But Chalmers is wrong in that we can't separate the psychological mind from behavior like he does. Okay? So there's a behavior mind problem. That's actually where I focus. Chalmers is also wrong when he doesn't separate phenomenological mind from talking mind. Okay? UTOK says there's not a mind-mind problem. There's a behavior mind problem. That's the BM3 problem. And we need to first say what mindedness is at a zoomed out level. So my basic point is all those layers of consciousness, they're in a field that they don't understand and haven't framed. And you zoom back and you're like, oh, I can put a box, the box psychology instead of consciousness, which actually is consciousness and science and mind and behavior. And self-consciousness. Then all of a sudden, once I go back to the landscape of consciousness, I'll map out for you what looks plausible, what looks very sound, what looks speculative, and what looks integrative. So a UTOK vantage point is like, we don't have the right terminology scientifically, big picture, okay? And the other thing I'll say really quick, and then I'll shut up, so I'll let you respond.
No, you're here to talk. Please don't shut up.
is that the enlightenment gap that UTOK solves says that there's two problems here around our difficulties. There's the ontological problem of what is mind relative to matter. Okay, the ontological problem is what in the world would we label as consciousness? Where does it come from? How do we solve that? That's the theory of reality. There's also an epistemological problem. Okay, that is subjectivity relative to scientific knowledge. And by the way, those are two totally different issues. What mind is in the world versus do you know things subjectively versus scientifically are two totally different issues, but we conflate them all the time.
Right.
Okay. We don't have a map that separates out, oh, this is a subjective ontology, okay, versus, I mean, there's a point about subjective ontology in the world versus a subjective epistemological issue. A subjective epistemological issue is all the problems that a knower knows gets when they have their unique idiographic particular place in the world that they're gripped to and identifying with. Okay?
Right.
So the fact that I think UTOK is beautiful, okay, is part of my subjectivity, and I'm very vulnerable then to my own self-deceptions, my own egoic attachments, my own preconceived notions, and my bias because of my unique, particular subjective attachment to that. We should be very aware of that.
Sure.
So all I'll say is there's subjectivity versus objectivity. There's also ontology of mind relative to matter. Very different questions. UTOK actually is structured to clarify those elements. I could go into more specificity about that, but that's part of the whole structure of the argument.
I'm asking, so how do we deal with this inherent aspect of psyche to fantasize and to make shit up, and to evaluate what is true and what is working and what not? I think that's the question.
Okay. Well, I mean, to ask the question, what is mind, to me, is very similar to scientifically. To ask is, what is matter? Okay. I mean, we got to come up with shit to figure out what matter is, right? And then we got to come up with shit to figure out what mind is. We can bullshit ourselves about what matter is. We have in the past. It's not all that different if we're just saying, what is the best and most coherent way to talk about the world collectively? So this is the
Right.
issue. We want to create an intersubjective, public, when we're doing science, psychological science, we want me and John and all the people that do cognitive science, behavioral science, neuroscience, etc., to be able to talk about
Sure.
this domain of the world scientifically. Each
Sure.
one of us will have our idiosyncratic perspectives, but the public domain of science is A, can it be defined? Okay. My interesting point to everybody, and doesn't have anything to do with our subjective biases, it just has to do with our collective inability to answer the question, is why the F are all the other sciences that are belief psychology, physics, chemistry, biology, why are they ontologically specifiable in the world?
Right.
Why? Why is it easy for us to say that, well, physics is the ground of energy and matter, and chemistry is the structure of matter, and we can say what astrology is, astronomy, we can say what geology is, and we can say what biology is, we can even say what neuroscience is with a fair degree of ontological specificity. What happens to our knowledge systems when we get to psychology, and why does our conceptual, consensual understanding of the world break when we say psychology? That's the ground of UTOK. And what this diagram behind me says is this is why. And it says it as precisely as
Right.
it clarifies, as the periodic table of the elements clarify why we should actually organize atoms by rows and columns and see the interrelations, because there's an electronic orbit structure that's circling around a nucleus that actually allows us to understand that. This tells us actually there are 4 different planes of existence that come off energy information that people haven't clearly specified. And that's as objectively observable in the world behaviorally as matter is. So
Right.
the UTOK comes along and says, actually, we haven't defined objectively what mindedness is in the world. That human mind problem is just, it's a complicated problem, but so was quantum mechanics. We can get into subjectivity, objectivity, but I don't think the subjectivity issue with mind per se is a problem, okay, when you're dealing with it objectively. The coin,
Now there you have it.
okay, the coin, as you know, represents psyche, and psyche per se holds subjectivity. That's where you have all of these fucking problems of,
Right.
oh, mind on top of mind. And by the way, that's not scientific. The coin's not part of my science.
Right.
Okay, so in UTOK it says, oh, all of those things are regulated to psyche in a particular way, defined as a subjective, idiosyncratic, particular, qualitative perspective on the world. Oh, by the way, that's not a scientific language game. Okay, so the coin, what you know as a subject, is framed by UTOK, and it says, yeah, don't apply science to this, and don't try to ask scientific questions about it necessarily. If you do, know what you're doing, because you're probably going to get in trouble.
So what do you think of Penrose's idea of, consciousness arriving because of the breaking of the wave function? Because I mean, he's mingling like basically 2 things together. What do you make of this?
Listen, I think that Penrose's a brilliant guy. I like a lot of what Penrose says in
Of
relation.
course.
But the bottom line is UTOK says there is a frame on the subjective objective matter mind problem that people are missing. Okay, and Penrose doesn't have it. As far as I can tell, nobody has it. There is available to us, and UTOK gives it to us. Now, once UTOK, if a bunch of physicists knew how to speak UTOK, I'd be fascinated to find out what it is. I don't have the expertise to dig through Penrose's knowledge around the collapse of the wave function, what he specified, all the way down to spinners and particular structures that then loop, and why it goes through Hameroff system, and how that actually resolves the hard problem. I still find that very confusing. I do think that he makes a very important point that there's something more than computation, okay, that is being pointed to with consciousness, and there is some sort of causal semantic binding of consciousness that I think integrated information is pointing to. And so there is certainly some value in what Penrose is talking about, and UTOK does like the idea that you want to create a network of understanding from human conscious observers and the measurement problem. There is a complicated network of things that UTOK frames for us in terms of the functional human identity matrix of an observer up here in the culture person plane of existence through your primate observer plane, all the way down to the measurement problem. And there is a network of identity that we can connect that makes sense out of those things. I would need a landscape of intersubjective UTOKers that know physics way better than I do, that would know microtubules at the level of, that then get into neuroscience better than I do, to say that, yeah, there's a real line of quantum collapse, okay? Like consciousness arises as a function of the wave collapse, as opposed to cause it. So he's like, no, consciousness doesn't cause the Wigner-Friend issue. That's weird. Consciousness doesn't cause the wave collapse. Consciousness emerges through a collapse of the wave function at some level, and it has to go down to that. That's a fascinating set of claims in and of themselves that have a, UTOK resonates with that metaphysically in some ways. I don't have a strong opinion whatsoever, because actually the stack of complexification that we were talking about and the interrelationships between all of those layers and levels, that's ill-specified as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, I'm not talking about Penrose as a physicist, obviously. I'm just find it weird. I feel it's like a category error, because it's like you have to leave the realm of cognition to see how a wave function, the breaking of the wave function leads to the emergence of consciousness. And, obviously we can't do that. So it's like, it's
so John Vervaeke and I are working on
Zeus or whatever. Yeah.
Right. John Vervaeke and I are working, next year we're going to produce a book on our work together on consciousness that explains how we are approaching and resolving a good chunk of the hard problem. Okay. We're going to divide the hard problem up and articulate. And I bring this up because one of our fundamental points is that you have to solve the nature problem, like what is consciousness, together with the function problem. Like, how does it actually work in the world? Now, if you go back to that landscape article, you'll see that 3 sentences in, or more or less, it says all of these theories have nothing to do with how consciousness actually works in the world. This is all about theories of consciousness, how it exists in the world. Okay? Now, because there's been a split off. The psychological mind does all of this, but we have to try to figure out how the phenomenological mind fits into the world. That's what all these things are. But they split the function problem from the nature problem. John Vervaeke and I are crystal clear that you better bind the function problem to the nature problem. Somebody like consciousness, we would critique because he doesn't understand this conversation from a functional perspective. But you better, if you're actually going to understand the nature. So John and I, as cognitive scientists and psychologists, would be like, okay, interesting points, but oh my God, like, how about I come and start talking about quantum mechanics from a knower perspective, and I don't know the math. I'm like, okay, that's going to be a problem. So to listen to folks who don't know the function of consciousness, tell us how it's structurally organized at that level, you start to really get into serious problems. So you better be tied to the function of cognition into consciousness, like, hey, I'm a conscious being justifying what I'm doing right now. That better be clear at the line of understanding. That's where one of the things where Penrose would break down.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned biases, right? That would be part of the justification system. Do I get that right?
Well, right. I mean, you're an organism who's also an animal that cares about stuff in the world that's relevant to your survival. So at that level, every organism is parsing the world, use John's, again, term, about what's relevant to its survival and interests. So already you're going to frame the world. Every organism is going to be, quote, biased by its interests. That's going to make what's salient, what's relevant, what it attends to, and what its emotional reactions to. So we're all situated as value seekers in the world, even at the organismic level. This gets consolidated in the nervous system. It's a value system. Okay, what's relevant to me, what's good for me, what's associated with my past successes and reinforcement, what's not. So that's going to attract me and give me good jolts of positive when it's there. That's at the base level. So bias is all the way down to the subject. The subject cares about what it cares about. If you're saying, why do I believe what I believe in, right? Certainly as a human being, justification systems theory and UTOK says, yeah, I'm seeking a justified state of being. Okay, and in very strong context, then my lensing for what is justified will shape me, and then we get all of the my side biases and all of the human cognitive heuristics. Okay, and of course we're going through an election now, so you can see this completely, right? Whereby we can say, hey, take a Trump supporter, right? And Kamala Harris was just on Fox News giving her interview, okay? And my dad's, somewhat reasonable Kamala Harris supporter, and I asked him how was it as a B plus. He gave her. He's like, well, she stood her ground. She didn't answer all the questions that great. I open up something. Kamala Harris's election chances are over, because this was the most ridiculous set of answers that anyone's ever given for anything, and this will blow up her chances. So one guy's got a stick to grind at the level of justification. So he pulls it. He's motivated to see the world a particular way, and then will justify accordingly, right? So that's these are just examples then of situated who's going to attend to what and under what context. The argument for justification is that you have a justifying, not a reasoning system. It's a justifying system. Those things overlap in certain contexts. They're very different in others. But you're generally a motivated reasoner. Motivation is another word potentially for bias. And then what is the motivation and what's the consistency that people are gripping with? Well, trying to maintain a justified state of being that will cause them to see the world and narrate their own world through a particular lens.
Great. So you mentioned the election that's coming up. In your book, you also mentioned the meaning crisis, and one of the aspects you mentioned in terms of the meaning crisis is the political polarization. And so we're talking about motivated behavior, bias, and so on and so forth. Why, from your point, why is it so difficult, even in, liminal web circles in which we move, to get a hold and a grip of your own biases? Because you would argue that as a future stage of development, or like a cultural stage, we should be more aware of our own biases. Let's say, it's like you could be like biased for Trump, you could biased for Harris, or you could biased like they're both crooked, and the media system feeds you bullshit, which is also like a biased stand, right? And it's like, as a European, I don't really have a dog in the game, but I'm feeling I'm getting spoon-fed bullshit. But I know this is also, a certain position and biased positions that you can take. But it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to get rid of these biases, these political biases, especially, maybe and especially in our circles as well. Why is that so difficult? Do you have like an explanation?
I mean, the short answer is, right, okay, so your justifying system is energized by your motivational system, okay? And you're often not really aware of that. You experience it often as seeing accurately the world, but it already presupposes and frames you and energizes you to see the world in a particular way. So it's bias. So you want to separate what's motivation and what's bias. If you use a broad definition of bias that overlaps with motivation, the entire system is biased. Your reasoning system exists as a biased system. That's actually what it does. Okay. Right. It's justifying seeing the world, what's valuable to you. Okay. So, for example, I just killed a fly. Why did I do that? Because it was annoying me. And I killed the fly. Okay. Now, was that a good thing? Not from the fly's perspective. Okay. So for me, in my world, the fly was an irritant, and I killed it. Now, is that bias? Okay. So what I would say is, well, actually, I'm a human primate. These things get in my way. My value system is flies don't really mean that much. And I will tell you that I don't value the fly very much. Now, to me, what I would argue, that's at least self-conscious bias or self-conscious motivation. I know what I'm doing. I'll tell you, and I'll lay it out. Okay. To me, what I would say is what I would hope for a meta-modern sort of system is to have self-recursive awareness of your motivational stances and to own them as part of the equation. So, hey folks, surprisingly enough, I'm endorsing UTOK. Let's get it right. Okay? Sure. Right? Now the question is whether, to me, the real danger of bias is for a left-leaning newspaper to set up and say, we see things as there is. We are only fair and balanced. Of course, that's Fox's, whatever. If we see things as they are and tell you as they are, without any awareness of what actually is that motivates their flashing the light on particular dimensions and telling you where all this stuff comes from. So my basic point to you is all reasoning is motivated. Motivation is energized by particular values that emphasize certain things, de-emphasize other. Therefore, they extract out particular pieces and give different things weighting that a different motivational set would If you call that bias, then everything's bias. There are hidden biases that are dangerous. Hidden bias is when I tell you, hey, I'm telling you exactly the way it is, when in fact, either I'm lying or I'm deceived my own self because I'm afraid of my motivation. Okay? And I want to emphasize that the reality is different than my motivation, and then it isn't driven by my motivation, it's different external to me. So I then say, hey, there's no bias. Okay? Science fundamentally is this entire structure trying to get rid of human bias. That's what it tries to do, and it never does. It never can. So there are biases built into the architecture of knowing, being. We need to be clear about this. Then the question, to me, the issue isn't like, well, can we get rid of bias? No, it's you shine the light on the evaluative positions of everybody, and you have us recursively own them. Okay? So in other words, you say, this is the way I'm biased. This is what I tend to emphasize.
Yeah, but
this
isn't that, I'm sorry to interrupt you, sorry to interrupt, but isn't that just reinforcing the bias that you have? And isn't that like putting more distance in the gulf between political polarization? Like, or what do you mean with owning?
Well, I mean, if everyone said right up front, I'm a Trump supporter, so therefore I'm going to see this Harris interview through a particular light, and I'm only going to extract out the things that seem to make sense and make my case, and by the way, I only do this. If you tell me up front that you don't only do this, that's a big difference than if you tell me I'm going to give it to you straight, I'm an independent reporter, and this is what happened, and then I fill it with all that stuff. So I'm saying we'd be a lot better off if people said what their position was in advance, and who are held accountable for what it was, as opposed to pretend that they weren't doing it that way.
Yeah, but now you're talking about different modes of reporting.
Well, I mean, I'm saying that we want the system to have this is what we want in psychotherapy. We want you to know what your defenses are. You will want you to gain insight into the ways in which you can self-deceive, label your tendencies to do this, and ask, am I being self-deception to the therapist? So the therapist could say, actually, you're really being defensive here, and get training from other people to increase the feedback, never removing yourself from the position, but increase the number of perspectives that you have, and increase honesty by the ways in which you're motivated to see the world a particular way. To me, that is the way you manage self-deception and maladaptive bias.
Right. I mean, the meaning crisis and political bias are deeply personal. And, you know the book from Jonathan Haidt, where he looked at, different, I think it was drives or something that were built in a certain way that we tilt towards the left or towards the right.
Well, the righteous mind is where he laid out his particular analysis. A very powerful analysis called the righteous mind. Mm-hmm.
So, and so, of course, you have to become aware at some point that you're susceptible to certain kinds of informations, that you have certain motives, that you are biased in a kind of way. And, I think, it's also a way just to understand, how the opposite bias and kind of works, and with a different motivation. And so as a way to, work with biases, and that personal biases is also something completely different as what media does, and it's media reporting. It's, and so.
Totally. So what is the system that's gripping? What motivates you to see the world a particular kind of way? What Jonathan Haidt does in The Righteous Mind, and he says there's actually these underlying implicit value structures, and he lists 6 of them. And he says politically what the left tends to do is just they emphasize 2 of them, and the conservatives actually emphasize a more distributed value network. They aren't doing this explicitly. In other words, they're not necessarily saying, hey, I value tradition explicitly. They're actually justifying why traditionalists deserve more power. Notice that's a difference that says, okay, here's where I'm coming value from first, and then this is why I'm going to act. I think actually many forms of advanced communication say, find the values first, talk from there, be self-reflective about how you might distort that based on defenses and the way your justifying mind works. Try to be honest about that, try to get feedback from others, and try to come together to be open to the potential of dysfunctional bias. And also, I think we also need to recognize, and everyone's going to be value instantiated, meaning you're never going to take value away, and value always frames what it is that you see and justify. That's the energy for it.
Right. I'm just wondering, and maybe I'm stupid, but I'm just wondering if it makes any sense to be, enamored with any candidate. You know, so I was just listening to this interview with Brett Weinstein and Jim Rudd, and Weinstein had this weird stance that if want the best future in any case, you have to vote for Trump. And it's like, really?
Well, I thought I read that. And I thought that was absurd. I think that he's Weinstein's completely wrong about that. And I'm certainly going to vote for Harris, although I'm not happy. I'm not going to be happy voting for Harris because I think the entire system is corrupt. Basically, and so I'm essentially apolitical. But my analysis, biased or not, is that Trump is a much more dangerous threat to the institution than another round of essentially continuation of Biden. So that's my assessment. Is that biased or is that limited? Is that insightful relative to where Weinstein is? Well, then you get into the whole issue about epistemology. Epistemology at philosopha. What really justifies, which, by the way, is the extension of refined justification as epistemology. That's the philosophical problem of what actually justifies knowledge. And in an intersubjective cultural context, it's a shit show, but you do the best you can.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's like you have to put your flag somewhere, and it's that where how do you say it, the rubber meets the road. It's like where it's like but you can't, and that's I think my point. You can't put the flag into the ground without being biased.
Right. Certainly you're going to create a slice. There's no pristine analytic. This is what, why did René Descartes do what he did with foundational philosophy? He was trying to do that. He was basically saying true epistemology is to find your way to foundationally, analytically, deductively true things that are irrefutable and build a knowledge from there that then is free, essentially, of bias and fallacy. I think that any foundational approach to philosophy in general is doomed. Any approach that tries to get us into the world that says we need pristine analytic knowledge to make true statements and claims, no, we're going to be clustered into bias and ambiguity. The issue is more abductive reasoning and best inference to best explanation and limitations and multiple perspectives that are then brought together based on expertise and refinement that give rise to a coherent understanding and value-based decisions across a time scale. Those are the kinds of things that lead to, it's adaptive thinking as opposed to sort of that's going to be embedded in all sorts of error. That's the state of which we are in for sure as human beings.
Right. So let's get back to your book after this short detour, this political one. So as far as I understand, you're working with UTOK more or less 20 years. How long? It's like it's
Right, yeah. So UTOK doesn't really get named, officially named until 2020, but the trajectory of UTOK starts in 1994. So I'm a psychologist, scientific psychologist that's going to be a clinician, and I want to do therapy, but I want to do therapy with scientifically justifiable knowledge, basically.
Right, and so
so that's where it starts. Mm-hmm.
And now it's the first book that is not purely academic. It's more broadly written, right? It's more accessible, like an academic book.
Right. So my first two books were, I'm an academic. My dad's a professor. I've done all my time in the academic world, doing the thing that justifying the arguments through academia. The first two books I wrote were written as an academic. All the citations and the defenses and embedded in a set of arguments. And this book is, hey, here's the thing. All these acronyms, all this crazy alchemy. All this, hey, here's what I see in the world. I'm not going to try to defend every piece of it. I'm not going to anchor it in all these different arguments and give you the background, all that. I'm going to lay it out and share it as a descriptive tome about where this system is that I've built.
So, right. And I know the process of writing, there's always something that is getting added. You learn something while writing. You learn something new. What's the biggest thing that you learned from writing this more popular book? In terms of UTOK itself. Mm?
Yeah, when I started, if you were to ask me kind of like, okay, how would you explain UTOK? All right. I certainly 2 years ago, I floundered on that question. Okay? This book now is so what this book really does, it consolidates my answer to the question, well, what is UTOK? How do you explain it? How do you describe it? Okay?
Right.
And it says, okay, UTOK can be consolidated and marry the coin to the tree in the garden under God. That's the mantra.
Right.
It brings these three different philosophical pillars together it enters through a new way of organizing our vocabulary, gives us a new meta-psychology, has these cool other elements, and then orients us towards the back half of the 21st century. So I guess I learned the stitching together of UTOK in its whole, in a way that I didn't have. Certainly when I sat down, prior to writing the book, it wasn't nearly as tight and clear as
Yeah.
prior.
Yeah, well, okay, that's in terms of the writing process. No, it's like what Wittgenstein said, everything that can be said should be said clearly. No, it's like it's no, because it's an art form itself to bring a complex theory down to its mimetic core. And it's
Totally.
like it's a shaping form because it's a to write a popular book, it's a different form, it's a different format,
Yep.
and it's not easy to yeah, as I said, to get down to the mimetic core of something.
Right, and I learned the prompt was so the summer before I was part of the group that got together that Zach Stein and Mark Gaffney pulled together on the cosmoerotic humanism, and they had just produced their David J. Temple essay about what cosmic erotic humanism. That, by the way, is the prompt for this book. It was the way they had said that and delivered their messages and broke it up into short little essays
Right.
and made it digestible and clear and declarative. I was like, I want a book like that for UTOK. So anyway, at the
Right.
level of the priming of it, the David J. Temple book was actually Cosmic Erotic Humanism was the prime for me to write the UTOK book the way it came out.
Would you say that that was what you were looking for the entire time? This mimetic core of something? If you look back at the history,
Well, at the only at when it needed to come to fruition. Okay, so I mean, it doesn't. It's I'm inventing it, discovering it, building it,
right,
right? So once it was UTOK in 2020, I've been groping around for its mimetic core, and the book was the consolidation of the mimetic core. So
right.
yes, at that level, sure.
No, because there was recently this discussion with Viveki about the diamond, and I think Jordan Peterson had a lecture about it too. As you know, that part of the psyche that is, somewhere in the future. It's you in the future, and it's pulling you, because there's an idea and you're drawn to it, but you don't
Totally.
know what it is, and so your whole being
Right.
gets shaped in the form to give rise to it and to give shape to it,
Yep.
so what's your diamond? Like, what was the initial idea that was driving you?
Well, actually, there are basically two phases. Okay, so the first phase is justification in the tree of knowledge. That's 1996, 1997. And that's me being a scientist saying, oh, we didn't map this correctly. We haven't clarified what humans are relative to the rest of the world. And then, oh, wow, actually, it's organisms. I mean, it's matter objects into living organisms and mining animals. And then psychology split across animals and humans. And I figured out a way to put that in the world. And now I want to share what the unified theory of psychology is so we can inform us as clinicians. That's phase one. Okay. And then phase two from 2000, that goes from 1996 into 1997 to 2016. And then phase two is 2016, 2018, and then beyond. That's when it became the garden and then the coin. Okay.
Right.
And then became the unified theory of knowledge. And what this book is, I wrote my academic book, A New Synthesis, 500 academic pages. I don't say anything about the garden or anything about the coin in writing that because that's outside convention. And I need a different arena where I can justify it because my academic colleagues were like, this is so weird that you would
Right.
never be able to do this. So what this book fundamentally is about my opportunity to tell the story of the garden and the coin on
Right.
top of the argument. That's what this book, that's what this diamond afforded me. And then to figure out
Right.
how to do that as the binding of the objective, intersubjective, and subjective epistemological lenses, and then to consolidate it into the structures, the different sections of the book, and ultimately summarize it in the mantra of marry the coin to the tree and the garden under God. That's what the art of the work became,
Yeah.
and what I took away from. That's the diamond.
It's interesting that we all have like some attractor point that we're drawn to. It's like it's super weird what people have for interests, and especially in the realm of psyche and psychology and consciousness, they're like, there are certain things that we're looking for, and
Totally.
we're drawn to it, and
Absolutely. Yeah, for me, yes, I'm groping for a particular kind of mapping of complexification that gives my system a sense of coherence. That's sort of a tractor state that I am hunting for very often.
Yeah. Okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a system that wants cognitive closure, which for me is a zoomed out coherence view. Cognitive closure refers to the fact that the system becomes satisfied that it has the capacity to bind together what are the elements that don't make sense. Okay, and whenever you have something really important that doesn't make sense, it will eat at you. Okay, one of the things I point to, like with 9/11 here in the States, when 9/11 happened that day, everyone should remember that day when it first dawned on that second plane hit the tower. Okay, everyone was like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" Right? And then you have this unbelievable impact with no capacity for cognitive closure, meaning you can't make sense out of it. Well, that's incredible impact without. So what nags you is sort of like, okay, what schematic structure is going to bring to bear, and I have a desire for meta coherence, which basically means it's sort of like there's this really big nagging question around I want to get a frame around, and that's what has drawn me to sort of like, what about this? I keep looking at things from different angles if I can't feel like I get a frame, and I've really had these two big jumps from 1996, 97, frame on psychology, and then this other jump was a frame on really a collective epistemology, kind of like a Wilbur structure, into a coherent ontology, aka unified theory of knowledge.
Right. I mean, there's a German term for this. It's called Widerspruchsfreiheit. It's a philosophical term. I think it means, you could translate it as being free of contradictions, basically. So create a model that, so you have like a psychological drive to coherence or congruence in a kind of way that you want to create a model where kind of every elements, all of the elements fit to that structure without creating contradictions, and so it's like I feel like we in our daily lives we are beings of contradictions. We say one thing, then we do another thing, or we have parts of our philosophy that don't fit to our overarching model or whatever. And so it's like, and so coming back to the beginning of the talk, I feel it's a very, and I think, wasn't it Suzanne Cook-Reuter who called this the alchemical stage, or was it Keegan? The drive to create a coherent, contradiction-free model of the world in a kind of sense.
Sure. And this is right. And this is where we want to identify bias. And you want to say, well, did you have daddy issues? The world's more complicated than you can be, right? So you have a fantasy, and I'll certainly own I have some of this, although as a clinician, this is not, it's a good question. Is that what it's about, right? I mean, Nietzsche sort of like before him is like, all this, he's the first postmodern or continental philosopher. It's like, actually, as a psychologist, Nietzsche as a psychologist, all you guys are building justifying models, calling it metaphysics, when it's your own projection onto the world. That's basically what he's saying, right? So as a psychologist that follows Nietzsche, I'll say, all right, here's my projection, right? Let me be clear about what my fantasy is for coherence. And let me make sure, if I'm going to also be, and let me make sure that I'm also a critical Fox scientist. And when I say critical Fox, so Stephen Jay Gould, a famous scientist, basically gave a nice little framework for foxes and hedgehogs. A fox is a specialist in a particular area that gets really refined knowledge and will blow you up. You try to come in and like, okay, I think I understand quantum mechanics. No, you don't. I'm a fox. I'm a specialist in this particular area. And you think you know this. You have these generalized terms, and the refined analysis of those terms is crap. And you have this this higher order conception of generalized knowledge that actually is lame. And a real specialist we need real, and the world really is, from a Fox perspective, it's really these real specialists that really give a rhizomium sort of delusive nature over knowledge, and any fantasy that could come along, right, and tie all that stuff together into some where the coherence of the fox is then put together with all the other foxes, so we have an absolute beautiful picture of all refined knowledge that fits together with no contradiction. That's a fantasy. Okay?
Right.
And I agree. That is a fantasy. That is not what UTOK is doing, by the way, exactly. And so you want to be clear about what the critique is. The hedgehog is to see the whole thing. Okay, the hedgehog is to see the whole thing. And the hedgehog's critique of the fox is, well, how does your system fit? And what is the system you're actually going to put it to ground your justification? Okay.
Right.
And then the hedgehog asks and zooms out. UTOK is a hedgehog system for sure, okay? But it is a hedgehog system that's anchored to a very specific analysis, philosophical, meta-scientific analysis. That's the problem of psychology and the Enlightenment gap. And so this is a real Fox problem, actually, because I could specify whether it is, become really refined, and then analyze it. And it is from there that I'm grounding this. And from there, that's why I make the defense that this isn't just my fantasy. It isn't just my biased need for coherence. It isn't just that I'm going to build some systemic system that politically and opinionated wise, I'll be like, if everyone could fit my autistic system, the world would be better off. Let me just tell you that. That's not what UTOK is. It's an academic thing that me and John, as academics, will start with problems. What's the problem? What's the problem of psychology? What's the hard problem of consciousness? What's the Enlightenment gap? And then from there, so if you don't answer that, Fox, fine, you can have specificity in quantum mechanics, but don't come here and tell me about psychology, because by definition you will say, well, all this refined knowledge that I have over here doesn't generalize, and you don't know how to connect it. Okay, so I will agree. I'm a bias towards hedgehog. Okay, I want Fox criticisms, and then I want to be clear about what I am arguing relative to those criticisms, and then see if this is a better model than we currently have.